December 13th, 1945. Inside Hameln Prison in Germany, a 22-year-old woman walks to the gallows. Her name is Irma Grese. The press called her the Beautiful Beast of Belsen. In less than an hour, she would become the youngest war criminal executed by British law in the 20th century. But this wasn't justice served in a courtroom. This was the culmination of the most systematic hunt for perpetrators in human history. What happened to the guards who ran the Nazi death machine after the camps were liberated? Who decided their fate? And why did some face the hangman's noose while others walked free within a decade? For 12 years, Nazi death camps operated as factories of extermination. Treblinka, Sobibor, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Behind the barbed wire, thousands of guardsmen and women carried out orders that defied human comprehension. They selected who lived and who died. They oversaw the gas chambers. They tortured, starved, and murdered millions. Then came liberation. April 1945. Allied forces broke down the gates and discovered the unthinkable. Mountains of corpses, walking skeletons barely clinging to life, and standing among them were some of the perpetrators. Some guards fled. Others surrendered. Many were killed on sight by enraged liberators and survivors. But the most brutal reckoning was yet to come. In courtrooms across occupied Germany, a new kind of trial would unfold. Not just for Nazi leaders, but for the rank-and-file killers who made the Holocaust possible. The guards who thought they were only obeying orders were about to discover that history had other plans. What followed was not mercy. It was a systematic prosecution that would span decades. Some faced immediate execution. Others endured years of imprisonment. Many escaped justice entirely. But for those who served in the death camps, liberation marked not the end of their ordeal, but the beginning of a reckoning that would determine whether evil could truly be held accountable. In this documentary, we uncover the brutal fate that awaited the Nazi death camp guards after the camps fell silent, and the complex web of justice, vengeance, and moral compromise that determined who lived and who died. April the 29th, 1945. U.S. soldiers of the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions approached Dachau concentration camp. What they found inside would transform them from liberators into judges, juries, and executioners within a matter of hours. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks commanded one of the units that breached Dachau's main gate. The scene that greeted his men defied comprehension. A train filled with decomposing corpses, prisoners reduced to living skeletons, and SS guards still in uniform. What happened next would become one of the most controversial moments of liberation: the Dachau reprisals. According to witness testimonies and military investigations, some of the Nazis were rounded up and summarily executed along with the guard dogs. The exact numbers remain disputed, but investigators determined that most likely 16 SS men were shot in the coal yard, 17 at Tower B, and perhaps a few more killed by US soldiers. The inmates themselves exacted their own justice. Anywhere from 25 to more than 50 guards were killed by inmates. But this spontaneous vengeance was only the beginning. As Allied forces swept across Germany, they discovered camp after camp, each revealing new horrors and more perpetrators. The question facing military commanders was immediate and pressing. What do you do with thousands of captured guards who had committed crimes that had no precedent in human history? At Bergen-Belsen, British forces found a different but equally horrifying scene. When the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment arrived on April 15th, they discovered approximately 60,000 prisoners, many dying from typhus and starvation. The camp's commandant, Josef Kramer, and his staff of guards were still present, having remained at their posts even as the British approached. Unlike at Dachau, there were no immediate executions at Belsen. Instead, the British made a calculated decision. These perpetrators would face formal trials. It was a choice that would establish the legal framework for prosecuting crimes that the world was only beginning to understand. The moment of liberation created an impossible moral situation. Survivors who had endured unimaginable suffering stood face to face with their tormentors. Allied soldiers, trained for conventional warfare, confronted evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. And the perpetrators themselves, from commandants to low-ranking guards, suddenly found themselves prisoners, awaiting a judgment that none of them had anticipated. In those first chaotic days after liberation, 3 paths emerged for dealing with the captured guards. Some faced immediate execution at the hands of liberators or survivors. Others were detained for formal legal proceedings. A third group, perhaps the largest, simply melted away into the chaos of post-war Germany, their crimes undetected and unpunished. But for those who were captured, the reckoning had only just begun. The Allied powers were about to embark on the most comprehensive effort to prosecute war crimes in human history. Yet they faced a fundamental challenge. How do you create justice for crimes that had never existed before? How do you punish guards who claimed they were merely following orders in a system designed to eliminate human conscience? The answers to these questions would determine not just the fate of individual perpetrators, but the very definition of individual responsibility in the face of state-sanctioned evil. The guards who had once held the power of life and death over innocent victims were about to discover that their own lives now hung in the balance, subject to a new kind of justice that would reshape the moral landscape of the post-war world. September 17th, 1945. In a converted school building in Lüneburg, Germany, the world's attention focused on an unprecedented legal proceeding. 45 defendants sat in the dock. 16 male SS, 16 female SS, and 12 prisoner functionaries, capos, including Josef Kramer and senior wardresses Irma Grese and Elisabeth Volkenrath. This was the Bergen-Belsen Trial, the first major war crimes prosecution that would target not just Nazi leadership, but the ordinary guards who had carried out the Holocaust's daily operations. The British had made a strategic decision. Rather than leaving justice to mob vengeance or military summary executions, they would establish legal precedent through formal trials. The Belsen trial was conducted by the British Military Tribunal under Court President Major General HMP Bernie Ficklin, sitting with 5 other officers. Each prisoner was represented by counsel, creating the framework for what would become the template for prosecuting crimes against humanity. But selecting which guards to prosecute presented an immediate challenge. Thousands of SS personnel had staffed the Nazi camp system. Many had fled before liberation. Others had been killed during the chaotic first days of freedom. The prosecution had to build cases against those they could capture, using testimony from survivors, documentary evidence, and the testimony of other perpetrators. The defendants in the Belsen trial represented a cross-section of the camp hierarchy. Josef Kramer, known as the Beast of Belsen, had commanded both Auschwitz-Birkenau and Bergen-Belsen. Under his authority served guards like Irma Grese, a 22-year-old who had volunteered for camp service and risen to become chief female overseer. Elisabeth Volkenrath, another defendant, had progressed from an unskilled laborer prior to becoming a guard to chief female overseer in both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. The prosecution strategy was revolutionary for its time. Rather than focusing solely on orders from above, they sought to prove individual criminal responsibility. Witnesses testified about specific acts of cruelty, torture, and murder committed by individual guards. The prosecution argued that following orders was no defense when those orders violated fundamental human dignity. Simultaneously, parallel proceedings were developing across occupied Germany. The Americans established their own military tribunals, including the famous Nuremberg trials for major war criminals. But it was in the camp-specific trials that the fate of ordinary guards would be determined. Of the 177 defendants across various trials, 24 were sentenced to death, 20 to lifelong imprisonment, and 98 received other prison sentences. The evidence presented in these trials exposed the systematic nature of the camp's operations. Guards testified about selection procedures, execution methods, and the daily routines of murder. Some showed remorse, others remained defiant. A few attempted to shift blame to superiors or claimed they were merely clerks or administrators. The female guards presented particular challenges for prosecutors and judges alike. Society had not prepared for the reality of women as perpetrators of mass murder. Yet the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses described female guards who participated in selections, beat prisoners to death, and took pleasure in inflicting suffering. As these early trials proceeded, they established crucial legal principles that would govern the prosecution of Holocaust perpetrators for decades to come. The concept of superior orders as a defense was rejected. The notion that individuals could be held accountable for crimes committed within a state apparatus was affirmed. Most importantly, the trials established that participating in genocide, even as a low-ranking guard, constituted crimes against humanity punishable by death. But even as these legal frameworks took shape, practical challenges mounted. The sheer number of potential defendants was overwhelming. Documentary evidence had been destroyed. Witnesses were scattered across Europe or had perished. Many guards had assumed false identities and disappeared into post-war chaos. The early trials were about more than individual justice. They were establishing the moral and legal foundation for confronting unprecedented evil. The guards sitting in the dock represented not just their own crimes, but the larger question of how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. The verdicts that followed would determine whether the post-war world could create accountability for crimes that challenged the very definition of human civilization. The condemned sat in the dock, each wearing a numbered placard like merchandise awaiting inspection. But these were not objects. These were individuals whose personal choices had contributed to the greatest crime in human history. As testimony unfolded, the court confronted a disturbing reality. The perpetrators of genocide were not monsters, but ordinary people who had made extraordinary choices. Irma Grese represented the most chilling example. Born in 1923 to a dairy worker in rural Germany, she had volunteered for camp service at age 19. Witnesses described her transformation from a farmer's daughter into what they called the Beautiful Beast. Former prisoners testified that she carried a pistol and a whip braided with cellophane, which she used to beat inmates. She was accused of setting dogs on prisoners and personally selecting victims for the gas chambers. During her trial, Grese showed no remorse. When questioned about her actions, she stated she was simply obeying directives and fulfilling her responsibilities. Yet witness after witness testified about her enthusiasm for cruelty, her sexual relationships with SS officers, and her apparent pleasure in inflicting suffering. The court faced a paradox that would define many Holocaust trials. How could someone so young and apparently normal have committed such heinous acts? Josef Kramer, the commandant of both Auschwitz-Birkenau and Bergen-Belsen, presented a different but equally disturbing profile. A former bookkeeper who joined the SS in 1932, Kramer had risen through the camp hierarchy through bureaucratic efficiency rather than ideological fervor. His defense strategy was to portray himself as an administrator following administrative procedures. The gas chambers, he claimed, were simply part of his administrative duties. Under cross-examination, Kramer's clinical detachment became his most damning characteristic. He testified about overseeing the murder of hundreds of thousands as if discussing inventory management. When prosecutors pressed him about the human cost of his actions, he responded that he was a soldier following orders from legitimate superiors. Elisabeth Volkenrath's case illustrated another disturbing pattern: the rapid elevation of ordinary women to positions of lethal authority. An unskilled laborer prior to becoming a guard, she had risen to become chief female overseer at both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Witnesses testified that she participated in selections, oversaw executions, and maintained discipline through terror. Her defense focused on necessity and survival. She claimed that refusing orders would have meant her own death, and that her actions were driven by fear rather than malice. Yet testimonies revealed that she had volunteered for additional duties, requested transfers to more brutal assignments, and appeared to derive satisfaction from her power over life and death. The trial revealed the complex psychology of perpetration. Some guards, like Grese, seemed to have embraced their roles with enthusiasm. In contrast, some male defendants asserted they were only complying with orders while privately expressing doubt. A few testified that they had tried to help prisoners when possible, though these claims were generally contradicted by witness testimony. The prosecution's strategy was to strip away the defendants' attempts to portray themselves as unwilling participants in a system beyond their control. Through detailed testimony, they demonstrated that individual guards had made countless discreet choices to volunteer for camp service, to request promotions, to exceed their orders, to inflict unnecessary suffering. The defense attorneys faced an impossible task. Their clients were guilty of crimes that defied conventional legal categories. The evidence against them was overwhelming, yet they had to provide legal representation while the world watched, expecting justice for unprecedented crimes. As witness after witness testified about specific acts of cruelty, torture, and murder, the court confronted a fundamental question about human nature. Were these individuals aberrations, psychopaths who had found an outlet for pre-existing sadistic tendencies, or were they ordinary people who had been transformed by a system designed to eliminate moral restraints? The answer emerging from the testimony was more disturbing than either alternative. The evidence suggested that normal people, given sufficient authority and ideological justification, could become willing participants in genocide. The guards had not been coerced at every moment. They had adapted, participated, and in many cases, exceeded their orders. This realization carried profound implications for the verdicts that would follow. If these individuals were ordinary people who had become killers, then their punishment would serve not just as individual justice, but as a warning about the capacity for evil that exists within normal human beings under extreme circumstances. The court was about to render judgments that would determine not just the fate of the accused, but the moral message that the post-war world would send about individual responsibility in the face of state-sanctioned murder. November 17, 1945. After 2 months of testimony, the British military tribunal prepared to render verdicts in the Bergen-Belsen Trial. The court had heard evidence of crimes that challenged existing legal frameworks, committed by individuals whose motivations ranged from ideological fervor to bureaucratic compliance to sadistic pleasure. 30 defendants were found guilty of at least one charge at Belsen and/or Auschwitz. 14 were acquitted. The court eventually handed down 11 death sentences. The verdicts reflected careful consideration of individual culpability rather than collective punishment. Josef Kramer received the death penalty. Despite his attempts to portray himself as a mere administrator, the court found that his role as commandant made him directly responsible for the deaths of thousands. The evidence showed that he had not merely followed orders, but had implemented them with bureaucratic efficiency that facilitated mass murder. Irma Grese also received the death sentence, making her the youngest person condemned to death by British law in the 20th century at age 22. The court dismissed her defense of merely complying with directives, determining that her actions consistently surpassed any lawful military instruction. Witnesses had testified about her personal participation in selections, her use of violence for personal gratification, and her apparent pleasure in inflicting suffering. Elisabeth Volkenrath joined Grese and Kramer on death row. The court determined that her role as chief female overseer, combined with witness testimony about her personal participation in murders, warranted the ultimate penalty. She was described as having been sentenced to death in 1945 for her crimes at both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. The remaining death sentences went to other guards and officials whose individual actions were deemed to constitute crimes against humanity. The court also gave 19 prison terms ranging from life to 1 year. These sentences reflected the court's attempt to calibrate punishment based on individual culpability rather than applying blanket justice. The 14 acquittals were perhaps equally significant. The court found that some defendants, while present at the camps, had not participated directly in murder or torture. These verdicts established an important precedent. Mere presence at a concentration camp was not sufficient for conviction. Individual criminal acts had to be proven. But the verdicts were only the beginning of the final chapter for the condemned. December 13, 1945, marked the execution date. The hangings were conducted with the greatest secrecy, presumably to foil any last-minute attempts at escape or rescue from the outside. Irma Grese walked to the gallows at Hameln Prison wearing a simple black dress. According to witness accounts, she maintained her composure until the end, showing no remorse for her actions. Her final words reportedly included a defiant statement that she had only done her duty. She was executed at Hameln Prison on December 13, 1945. Josef Kramer met the same fate on the same day. The man who had overseen the murder of hundreds of thousands was executed with the clinical efficiency that had characterized his own administration of death. His final statements focused on his military oath and his claim that he had followed legitimate orders. Elisabeth, Volkenrath, and the other condemned guards were executed alongside Kramer and Grese. The executions were carried out by experienced British executioners who ensured that death was swift and efficient. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves within the prison grounds. The executions sent a clear message to other perpetrators who had not yet been captured or tried. Individual participation in genocide would be punished with the ultimate penalty, regardless of claims about following orders or bureaucratic necessity. Yet even as justice was administered to these 11 individuals, thousands of other perpetrators remained at large. The Bergen-Belsen Trial was only the first of many proceedings that would span decades. Other courts were simultaneously trying different groups of defendants, each contributing to the evolving understanding of how to prosecute crimes against humanity. The immediate aftermath of the executions revealed the complexity of post-war justice. Some observers praised the swift administration of justice for unprecedented crimes. Others questioned whether execution was the appropriate response, arguing that life imprisonment might have been more fitting. A few critics suggested that the trials themselves were victors' justice rather than impartial legal proceedings. But for the survivors who had testified, the executions provided a sense of closure that had seemed impossible during their years of imprisonment. The individuals who had held absolute power over life and death had themselves faced the ultimate penalty for their crimes. The executions marked a turning point in the post-war reckoning with the Holocaust. They established that individual perpetrators could be held accountable for their participation in state-sponsored murder, regardless of their rank or their claims about adhering to directives. They also demonstrated that the Allied powers were committed to pursuing justice through legal proceedings rather than leaving vengeance to mob action. Yet questions remained about the thousands of other guards who had not been captured, the inconsistencies in different legal systems, and the long-term implications of these precedents for international law. While 11 condemned guards faced execution at Hameln Prison, a dramatically different fate awaited perpetrators tried in other jurisdictions. The post-war prosecution of camp guards revealed a startling inconsistency in how justice was administered, depending on which Allied power controlled the proceedings and when the trials occurred. The American approach to prosecuting concentration camp guards differed significantly from the British model. At the Dachau war crimes trials, conducted by U.S. military courts from 1945 to 1948, American prosecutors focused primarily on higher-ranking officials and those who had committed the most egregious crimes. Lower-ranking guards often received lighter sentences or were not prosecuted at all. This disparity became evident in the prosecution of guards from camps like Mauthausen, Buchenwald, and Dachau itself. While some received death sentences, many others were sentenced to prison terms that would later be reduced significantly. American military governors, under pressure to restore stability in occupied Germany, began commuting sentences within just a few years of the original trials. The French prosecution of guards from camps in their occupied territories followed yet another pattern. French military tribunals, dealing with camps like Natzweiler-Struthof, tended to focus on crimes committed against French nationals. Guards who had murdered French prisoners faced severe penalties, while those whose victims were primarily from other nationalities sometimes received more lenient treatment. Perhaps most significantly, the Soviet approach to captured guards was largely hidden from Western scrutiny. Guards captured by Soviet forces often simply disappeared into the Gulag system, where they faced years of imprisonment under conditions that mirrored the camps they had once administered. Unlike Western trials, there were no public proceedings, no defense attorneys, and no international oversight. The most striking disparities emerged in the treatment of female guards across different legal systems. While Irma Grese and Elisabeth Volkenrath were executed by the British, other female guards in American custody often received prison sentences. Some, like certain guards from Ravensbrück who were tried by Soviet courts, received sentences of 10 to 25 years, but were released during the 1950s amnesties. One guard sentenced to 10 years in prison is still alive today, and in a rare interview said, "Did I make a mistake? No, the mistake was that it was a concentration camp, but I had to go to it. Otherwise, I would have been put into it myself." This unrepentant attitude was common among guards who received lighter sentences, suggesting that the severity of punishment may have influenced perpetrators' willingness to accept responsibility for their actions. The Auschwitz trials, conducted primarily by Polish courts, represented another approach to justice. 6 defendants, including Rapportführer Oswald Kaduk and political department henchman Wilhelm Boger, were sentenced to life imprisonment, and the others to prison terms of 3 to 14 years. However, many former SS men from the Auschwitz garrison were examined as witnesses in this trial, but never faced charges themselves. These inconsistencies created profound questions about the nature of justice for Holocaust perpetrators. Guards who had committed similar crimes in different camps faced dramatically different consequences based on factors beyond their control. Which Allied power captured them when they were tried, and what political pressures influenced their cases. The disparity became even more pronounced as the Cold War intensified. By the late 1940s, both American and British authorities were under pressure to focus on the Soviet threat rather than continuing to prosecute Nazi war criminals. Many of the prisoners were released early in the 1950s as part of broader amnesties designed to integrate West Germany into the Western Alliance. This shift in priorities meant that guards who might have faced execution in 1945 were receiving commuted sentences by 1950. Some who had been sentenced to life imprisonment were released after serving less than a decade. The message sent to other potential perpetrators was ambiguous. Individual accountability for participation in genocide was important, but not important enough to override geopolitical considerations. The disparities extended beyond sentences to the basic question of who was prosecuted at all. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands served as SS or auxiliary personnel in the camp system. Of these, only a fraction ever faced trial for their crimes. The vast majority simply returned to civilian life, their participation in genocide undetected or unpunished. Geographic location played a crucial role in determining fate. Guards who fled to South America often lived openly under their real names, protected by governments that were either sympathetic to former Nazis or unwilling to cooperate with Allied prosecutors. Those who remained in Germany but assumed false identities frequently succeeded in avoiding prosecution, especially as denazification efforts wound down in the early 1950s. The statistical reality was sobering. Guards who had participated in the murder of millions had roughly a 1% chance of facing serious legal consequences for their crimes. The other 99% would live out their lives as ordinary citizens, their past crimes hidden or forgotten. This great disparity in justice would have profound consequences for post-war society and for subsequent efforts to prosecute war crimes. It established a troubling precedent that participation in genocide, while theoretically punishable, was practically unlikely to result in meaningful consequences for most perpetrators. By 1955, most Western Allied authorities had declared their war crimes prosecution programs complete. Prison gates opened across Germany as commuted sentences released guards who had once been condemned to death or life imprisonment. The message seemed clear. The chapter on accountability for Holocaust perpetrators was closing. But for a dedicated group of prosecutors and investigators, the hunt was just beginning. The landscape of justice had shifted dramatically in the decade following liberation. Cold War priorities had superseded war crimes prosecution in both American and British policy. The creation of West Germany as a strategic ally required integrating former Nazis into the new democracy, including some who had served as concentration camp guards. Yet evidence of unpunished crimes continued to surface. In 1958, the Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes was established in Ludwigsburg, Germany. This office would become the nerve center for tracking down perpetrators who had assumed new identities and built new lives after the war. The Eichmann trial in 1961 marked a turning point. Adolf Eichmann's capture by Israeli agents in Argentina and his subsequent trial in Jerusalem demonstrated that Nazi war criminals could still be held accountable regardless of how much time had passed or where they had fled. The trial also revealed the extent to which former camp guards had dispersed across the globe. Protected by sympathetic networks and complicit governments, South America emerged as a particular haven for escaped perpetrators. Countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile had provided refuge for numerous former guards, many of whom lived openly under their real names. The famous cases of Josef Mengele and other high-ranking Nazis obscured the reality that hundreds of lower-ranking guards had also found sanctuary in South American communities with significant German populations. In the United States, the Office of Special Investigations was established in 1979 to track down war criminals who had entered the country illegally after the war. Their investigations revealed that several dozen former camp guards had successfully immigrated to America by concealing their wartime service. These cases typically resulted in deportation rather than prosecution, as the legal framework for trying decades-old crimes committed on foreign soil was complex. The pursuit of aging perpetrators raised profound questions about the nature of justice delayed. By the 1980s, most former guards were elderly men and women who had spent decades as ordinary citizens. They had raised families, built careers, and integrated into their communities. Their neighbors, colleagues, and even their own children often had no knowledge of their wartime activities. The case of John Demjanjuk illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations of late prosecution. Accused of being Ivan the Terrible, a guard at Treblinka death camp, Demjanjuk was extradited to Israel, tried, and initially sentenced to death. However, the case was later overturned due to questions about his identity. He was subsequently deported to Germany, where he was convicted in 2011 of being an accessory to murder at Sobibor, dying before his appeal could be heard. Female guards proved particularly difficult to track down. Many had married after the war and changed their names, making identification nearly impossible without specific documentation. Those who were located often faced different treatment than their male counterparts. Several female guards were identified living quietly in various countries, but were deemed too elderly or infirm for prosecution. The passage of time created practical challenges that went beyond legal complexities. Witnesses died, documents were destroyed or lost, and memories faded. By the 1990s, prosecuting agencies faced the reality that most potential defendants were in their 80s or 90s, raising questions about the practical and ethical implications of pursuing elderly individuals for crimes committed decades earlier. Yet some cases continued to emerge. In 2015, German prosecutors successfully convicted Oskar Gröning, the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, despite his advanced age. His conviction demonstrated that even administrative roles in the camp system could result in prosecution as accessory to murder. Gröning died before serving his sentence, but his trial sent a message that accountability remained possible even 7 decades after liberation. The statistical reality remained sobering. Of the hundreds of thousands who served in the Nazi camp system, fewer than 2% ever faced any form of legal accountability. The vast majority lived full lives without ever answering for their participation in genocide. Some died peacefully in their beds, surrounded by families who never learned about their past. Others took their secrets to their graves, leaving behind only fragmentary evidence of their crimes. The long shadow of unpunished perpetrators extended beyond individual cases to broader questions about justice and memory. What did it mean for society that participation in genocide carried so little practical risk of punishment? How did the escape of so many perpetrators affect survivors' faith in justice and democracy? These questions became more pressing as the last generation of Holocaust survivors began to pass away. With direct witnesses disappearing, the pursuit of aging perpetrators took on symbolic importance that transcended individual cases. Each prosecution represented an affirmation that some crimes are so heinous that they transcend normal statutes of limitations and jurisdictional boundaries. Yet the reality remained that the vast majority of camp guards had successfully escaped accountability. They had returned to civilian life, built new identities, and died as ordinary citizens. Their escape raised fundamental questions about the effectiveness of post-war justice and the challenges of prosecuting crimes committed within totalitarian systems. December 13th, 2045. 100 years to the day after Irma Grese walked to the gallows at Hameln Prison, the last known concentration camp guard died peacefully in a nursing home in South America. He was 102 years old. His family knew him as a quiet grandfather who spoke little about the war. His neighbors remembered him as a helpful man who maintained a careful garden and fed stray cats. They never knew he had once stood guard at Treblinka death camp, watching as trains arrived daily with human cargo destined for the gas chambers. His peaceful death marked the end of an era, not just of individual perpetrators, but of the moral complexity that defined post-war justice. The hunt for Nazi war criminals, which began with summary executions in liberated camps, had evolved into the longest-running effort to prosecute crimes against humanity in human history. Yet its ultimate legacy remains deeply ambiguous. The numbers tell a stark story. Fewer than 1,000 war criminals were executed or received life sentences. The overwhelming majority, more than 99%, lived out their lives without facing meaningful consequences for their participation in genocide. This statistical reality forces uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice after mass atrocity. Was the post-war reckoning with Holocaust perpetrators a success because it established legal precedents for prosecuting crimes against humanity? Or was it a failure because it allowed the vast majority of perpetrators to escape accountability? The case of Irma Grese, executed at 22 for crimes committed when she was barely out of her teens, stands in stark contrast to guards who received light sentences or no prosecution at all. Her execution satisfied demands for immediate justice and sent a powerful message about individual accountability. Yet it also highlighted the arbitrary nature of who faced consequences and who escaped them. The geographic lottery of justice proved decisive for thousands of perpetrators. Guards captured by the British faced military tribunals with relatively consistent standards. Those taken by American forces encountered a justice system increasingly influenced by Cold War priorities. Guards who fled to South America often lived openly under their real names, protected by sympathetic governments and German expatriate communities. Perhaps most significantly, the pursuit of camp guards revealed the limitations of legal systems designed for conventional crimes when confronted with systematic evil. The concepts of superior orders, duress, and individual culpability took on new meaning when applied to participants in an industrial killing machine. Courts struggled to calibrate punishment for crimes that had no historical precedent and may have no future parallel. The female guards presented particular challenges that reflected broader social assumptions about women's capacity for evil. Irma Grese became a symbol of feminine malevolence, while other female guards were often dismissed as victims of circumstance or masculine influence. This gendered approach to justice obscured the reality that women had made individual choices to participate in genocide, just as men had. The long-term consequences of prosecutorial inconsistency extended beyond individual cases to broader questions about deterrence and prevention. If participation in genocide carried only minimal risk of punishment, what message did this send to potential perpetrators in future conflicts? The genocides in Rwanda, Bosnia, and other locations suggest that the post-war precedents may have been insufficient to deter similar crimes. Yet the pursuit of aging perpetrators into the 21st century also demonstrated the enduring power of moral accountability. Cases like those of John Demjanjuk and Oskar Groening showed that some crimes transcend normal limitations of time and jurisdiction. Their prosecutions affirmed that participation in genocide carries lifetime consequences, even if those consequences are delayed for decades. The story of the Nazi death camp guards after liberation ultimately reveals as much about post-war society as it does about wartime crimes. The priorities that shaped prosecution decisions, geopolitical strategy, resource constraints, bureaucratic efficiency, reflected the values and limitations of the societies administering justice. For survivors, the mixed legacy of post-war justice carried profound personal implications. Some found closure in the executions and imprisonments of their former tormentors. Others were haunted by the knowledge that most perpetrators had escaped punishment entirely. The arbitrariness of who faced justice and who didn't reflected the same randomness that had determined who lived and who died in the camps themselves. The testimonies given in courtrooms from Lüneburg to Nuremberg became part of the historical record, ensuring that the crimes would not be forgotten even as the perpetrators disappeared into civilian life. Survivors like Primo Levi, Viktor Frankl, and thousands of others transformed their suffering into literature, philosophy, and activism that would educate future generations about the consequences of unchecked evil. But perhaps the most important legacy of the post-war reckoning was not the individual fates of specific guards, but the establishment of principles that would guide future efforts to address mass atrocity. The rejection of superior orders as an absolute defense, the recognition that genocide constitutes crimes against humanity that transcend national boundaries, the affirmation that individuals can be held accountable for participation in state-sponsored murder. These principles would inform the creation of international criminal tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, the establishment of the International Criminal Court, and ongoing efforts to prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity around the world. The inconsistencies and failures of post-war justice provided lessons about the importance of swift action, consistent standards, and sustained political commitment to accountability. The guards who escaped punishment carried their secrets through decades of ordinary life. Some may have felt guilt or remorse that they never expressed publicly. Others, like the guard who insisted in a rare interview that she had made no mistake, maintained their justifications until death. A few reportedly confessed to family members on their deathbeds, leaving behind traumatized relatives who struggled to reconcile the person they knew with the crimes they had committed. The children and grandchildren of both survivors and perpetrators inherited the moral complexity of this history. Some descendants of guards discovered their family's dark past through historical research or legal proceedings. Others suspected but never confirmed their relatives' wartime activities. This intergenerational transmission of trauma and guilt became another dimension of the Holocaust's lasting impact. As the last survivors and perpetrators passed away, the responsibility for preserving memory and ensuring accountability shifted to historians, educators, and legal institutions. Museums like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem became repositories not just for historical artifacts, but for moral lessons about the consequences of indifference to evil. The debate over prosecuting elderly war criminals continued until the very end. Critics argued that pursuing men and women in their 90s served no purpose beyond symbolic justice. Supporters contended that some crimes are so heinous that they transcend normal limitations on punishment. The final prosecutions in Germany during the 2010s represented a last effort to affirm the principle that participation in genocide carries lifetime consequences. Today, the physical evidence of the camps remains as monuments to both the crimes committed and the justice attempted. The preserved barracks at Bergen-Belsen, the restored gates at Dachau, the preserved gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau serve as reminders of what happened when ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary evil. The fate of the Nazi death camp guards after liberation ultimately tells two stories. The first is about the limitations of human justice when confronted with crimes that challenge the foundations of civilization itself. Legal systems designed for individual crimes struggle to address systematic evil. Political priorities often trumped moral imperatives. Geographic accidents determined who faced accountability and who escaped it. The second story is about the enduring power of moral responsibility. Despite inconsistencies, delays, and failures, the post-war effort to prosecute camp guards established precedents that continue to shape international justice today. It affirmed that individuals cannot escape accountability by claiming they were merely following orders or serving their country. It demonstrated that some crimes transcend national boundaries and normal limitations on punishment. The guards who walked to the gallows at Hameln Prison faced the ultimate penalty for their participation in genocide. Their executions served as both individual punishment and collective warning. Yet the guards who lived peacefully into old age, their crimes undetected and unpunished, may have sent an equally powerful message about the practical limits of justice after mass atrocity. The brutal fate of some Nazi death camp guards and the comfortable escape of others reflects the moral complexity that continues to challenge societies confronting systematic evil. Their story reminds us that accountability for the worst crimes requires not just legal frameworks, but sustained political will, adequate resources, and unwavering commitment to the principle that some acts place their perpetrators beyond the reach of mercy or forgiveness. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson from this history is not about the fate of individual perpetrators, but about the choices that ordinary people make when confronted with systematic evil. The guards who volunteered for camp service, who exceeded their orders, who took pleasure in inflicting suffering, began as ordinary citizens who made extraordinary choices. Their story serves as a warning about the human capacity for evil and a reminder that protecting human dignity requires constant vigilance against the forces that would destroy it. The reckoning that followed liberation, with all its inconsistencies and failures, represents humanity's imperfect but necessary effort to affirm that some boundaries must never be crossed, and that those who cross them must face the consequences, however delayed and incomplete justice may be. The last Nazi death camp guard is gone, but the questions raised by their crimes and by society's response to those crimes remain as urgent today as they were in the aftermath of liberation. The price of evil, it turns out, is not just what perpetrators pay, but what societies must sacrifice to ensure that accountability remains possible even in the face of unimaginable horror. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.